Awesome. Okay, so I think we are good to get started. Um, cool. So today I will be presenting a paper that is titled Flexible Patched Brain Transformer or PBT for EEG decoding. So essentially it's a transformer model for EEG. The idea here is how we can take a model like a vision transformer and apply it to something like EEG in the most efficient way possible. So this is our roadmap. So we'll start by understanding why they are doing what they're doing and what are currently some of the constraints with EEG decoding models. Then we look at the method. So essentially the model design, what is it that they have done and what different training settings they have tested. We'll also look at the experimentation as well as the results and the ablation studies that they have done. I'll finish the presentation with some limitations and going over the conclusion and what future work can be done in this domain. Okay, so I think we can get started with understanding why EEG decoding is challenging. So EEG decoding comes with a few hard constraints that show up in almost every real data set. So the first is the low signal to noise ratio. So neural activity is often mixed with motion artifacts or ocular artifacts and sensor noise. And secondly, the data distribution can shift across a lot. So both across participants and across sessions for the same participant. So the model that looks very strong within session can often degrade when we test on held out sessions for unseen subjects. So this is a very real problem in EEG, and we researchers who work with EEG deal with this on a very real day-to-day basis. And lastly, EEG datasets can typically be small depending on the task that you're working with, which makes these high capacity models especially vulnerable to overfitting under very strict generalization settings. So transformers can be appealing in this situation because self-attention can integrate information globally across time and channels rather than relying only on, say, local receptive fields in CNNs. But transformers also have a limitation. They can tend to be data hungry and sensitive to training choices. And many of these EEG transformer pipelines still depend on a substantial CNN-based tokenizer that can often add a lot of parameters and reduce the flexibility. So we'll touch on this a little bit more as we go into the presentation. And essentially the core idea of this paper is that can we keep the benefits of a transformer backbone while making the front end more lightweight and more adaptable? So essentially a parameter efficient patch-based transformer that can naturally accommodate different channel montages and trial lengths. This is to be determined whether this paper has actually achieved that, but this is their claim. And there is essentially, this can also allow practically to pre-train across multiple data sets and transfer to downstream decoding tasks. Okay. So where does this work actually fit in the current landscape of models that we see? So the authors position their work against three major modeling families commonly used in EEG decoding. The first are CNN-based baselines, such as EEG-net or ATC-net. These models benefit from strong inductive biases, so they have local filtering and hierarchical feature extraction, which often makes them reliable in small data settings. However, they are typically designed around a fixed input format, specific channel layouts, and specific time lengths, and their performance can generally stagger when the objective is broader transfer or scaling across data sets. The second are graph-based approaches. These methods explicitly encode relationships between electrodes and can leverage spatial structure, but they usually require a predefined graph or a montage, which again makes cross-dataset transfer difficult when sensor layouts differ. So in practice, generalization challenges still remain with these methods as well. The third are transformer-based EEG models. Transformers are again attractive because attention can integrate information globally across channels, which can be very, very meaningful and useful for certain tasks. But as I mentioned earlier, EEG transformers can rely on a CNN tokenizer to produce tokens. So basically, there are certain models in which we treat the EEG input as an image. So basically, either you can treat the signal itself as an image, or you can do certain frequency transforms to generate spectrograms. And these spectrograms basically just represent the frequency content of the signal. And these are then given as input to the model. So in such input conditions, people generally prefer to use CNN-based tokenizers because the hope is that they will be able to capture local patterns better in the context of images. And these CNN tokenizers, while they do a good job, they can be very parameter inefficient. So this motivates the gap in which they position their model, where they want to retain a transformer backbone, but replace the heavy tokenization with a lightweight, flexible patch embedding so that the model can scale pre-training across multiple data sets and remain usable when channel montages and trial lengths differ. So the papers...
Sorry for interrupting. Just one question. Like I'm not familiar in the field of this EEG processing. Sure. So you mentioned like we are using CNNs and like VIT kind of patch transformers for EEG signals. So you take the EEG signal as a graph, like an image, and then you input that image into CNN or a transformer. Is that what the pipeline looks like?
Yes. So the more common way to do is to do a frequency transform on the data. And what that does is generate something called a spectrogram. And that spectrogram...
That's also again a graph image, right? Like a frequency.
It's an image, yes.
Okay.
It's just an image that visually represents the frequency content of the EEG signal. And in tasks where the frequency plays a very key role, for example, in sleep staging, we know very specifically that for a particular stage of sleep, what frequency will be dominating. So in such applications, using spectrograms like this has shown to be very effective. So that is one method of doing it. The other obvious way is to give the time series signal itself.
But why do you provide time series signal as an image, like instead of just a stream of numbers? Like, is there any advantage of constructing a graph out of it and processing it as an image with CNN solution transformers rather than time series data?
Yeah, no, definitely. The approach of giving it as an image is slightly less common. It is not done very often because when you feed the raw signal, there's a lot more you can do, right? When you're giving the raw signal, you can play around with local features, global context, you can combine them, you can split them into different frequency bands depending on what you think might be useful. So the more common approach would definitely be to just work with the raw data.
Okay. But so in this approach, like they are taking a vision-based approach, is it?
No.
So in this paper that
No, here also they are giving the signal itself. But they're trying to adapt the vision-based model for that. Yeah, so it's not exactly like just an image. It's the actual signal, but they are trying to frame it in the context of a VIT because the rest of the model is basically just a VIT. All they've done is like played around with the input side, the patching, and the tokenizer essentially.
Okay.
The rest of the model is as it is a vision model.
Okay.
Yeah. That's
Thanks.
why they consistently try to frame it as a VIT style model. Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick question. I think I missed. What is the full form of PBT here?
Aditi, you're not audible.
Am I audible now?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah,
Sorry,
just a
what was the
quick question.
question?
What is
Yeah.
the full form of PBT? I think I missed.
Yeah, no, that's just the patch brain transformer. So this
Okay.
is the model they have proposed. I've just
The name of the
abbreviated as,
architecture.
yeah, PBT.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, no problem. So the main contributions are basically they introduce a VIT style patch transformer for EEG, where the input is treated as a channel by time grid and it's tokenized into temporal patches. So again, to come back to Niruhan's point, these are temporal patches. And we'll look into what that is exactly. And they add a lightweight linear embedding. So they keep emphasizing this point that they have avoided a heavy CNN tokenizer. Again, to be determined whether that actually gives us certain benefits. Second, the design is naturally flexible, and we will look into this a bit more as to why that is the case, that it can accommodate different channel counts and trial lengths. And the third is that they test with different training strategies. So supervised training, self-supervised pre-training, training from scratch, and they essentially compare these to see what works best in the context of EEG. And they've also done some interpretation-based analysis. So they've kind of looked at the weights and some of the attention maps and tried to infer certain things based on that to better understand, like, is the model actually learning what they are hoping for it to learn? Okay. So are there any other questions up till this point? Okay. If not, let's go ahead. Okay, so this is the generic architecture at a glance. So for those of you who are familiar with VIT, this image is going to look very familiar. You have your EEG channels, which they've broken down into temporal patches. Now, what they've done is that they've replaced the CNN tokenizer with a linear projection. This is then combined with positional embeddings and passed to our transformer encoder, which you can see on the right-hand side. And finally, you have your classification head. So we'll go into these one by one to understand exactly what they are doing and how they are trying to adapt this for EEG. But this is the overall architecture. Okay. So the first step is to formally define what our input is. So a single trial matrix can be defined as the input X, which is of the dimension C cross T, where C is the number of channels and T is the number of time samples. So you can envision it almost like an image where you have your channels stacked one by one, and then you have your time points. So it essentially forms something like this. So it's C cross T. And essentially, this is again to align it to this idea of an image. Keep in mind, it's not exactly an image. We are still working with the waveforms themselves, but they are aligning it to that same idea of a VIT. Okay, so this is our input. The pre-processing is very standard. So they have used multiple data sets. So in order to keep it compatible, they have resampled all of them to 250 hertz. And these are very standard steps in an EEG pre-processing pipeline. So you tend to resample the data because often EEG data is recorded at a very high sampling rate, like 1,000 hertz or so. So we don't really need that much. So if you generally downsample to 512 hertz, they've done it to 250, and that's absolutely fine. Now, the range in which you bandpass filter entirely depends on the task at hand. So the data sets that they have chosen are all motor imagery related. So in motor imagery, what essentially happens is that the participants are presented with a visual stimulus, and depending on the stimulus, they have to make certain movements. So this can be like moving their right hand, or moving their left hand, or moving their right foot, left foot, and so on. So they are motor tasks. And it's called imagery because you have a visual input. So generally, for motor imagery tasks, you would tend to filter the signal between 8 and 45 hertz. Now, this choice is entirely dependent on clinical studies that have determined this frequency range to be important for motor imagery tasks. So that is why they have chosen this range. And then they've just done channel-wise z-scoring to stabilize the scale and preserve within session amplitudes. Okay, so any questions up till this point? Okay. So the next step is how they generate these temporal channels. So you choose a patch length. So here they've taken it to be D, and D, they've picked it as 64 samples. So you split each channel's time series. So you are doing this per channel, and that is very important because that will essentially allow us to be able to handle multiple channels. So basically, you have your channels and you have your time points, right? So for one channel, you want to split the time series for that channel into D length patches, okay? So essentially, for a signal of length T, you will get T by D samples. And since you have C channels, the total number of tokens will be C times T by D. Okay. And essentially, they have picked 64 samples. And at 250 hertz, this comes out to about 0.5 seconds. Okay. So essentially, why are they patching like this? Because this can allow them to naturally handle variable C and T. So transformers themselves can handle variable input length, right? So that is already taken care of. The second thing that we need to worry about with EEG are the channels. But when you patch in a way that you only take a single channel at a time, you are essentially just taking that channel, patching it, then patching the next, then patching the next, and then you eventually flatten everything and pass it to the model, right? So no matter how many channels I add, it doesn't really make a difference. I know there are certain drawbacks to this particular approach because essentially you are no longer looking at cross-channel interactions, right? Because you're patching each channel in itself, you are not looking at cross-channel interactions, but what they claim is that attention essentially handles that later in the pipeline. Okay. And this basically matches the VIT design paradigm that has been shown to work so well already. Now, one thing that they have not made clear is that when they patch a single channel, they have not made it clear how they are ordering these patches when they flatten the channels. So essentially, there are two ways in which you can do this. So either what you can do is take the first channel, you compute all the patches, then you do the second, put all the patches, then the third, and you essentially put the patches channel by channel. That is a channel major ordering. The second can be a time major ordering. So where you take the first patch across all the channels. then the second patch across all the channels. So they have not really made it clear how they have exactly done this flattening, but my assumption and the most like what would make sense to me would be to do it in a channel major way. So you do all the patches for the first channel, all the patches for the second, and so on. Okay. So the next step is the linear projection. So they put a lot of
Just a question,
emphasis.
Daya.
So,
So why would the ordering of the patch matters if they're employing attention mechanisms, right? So anyway, in any order you pass the input, if you
yeah,
are employing an attention mechanism, they can still talk to each other, right?
right,
Irrespective of the distance between the patches.
right.
So is
That
there
is
any,
true.
yeah. So I just wanted to know
Yeah,
the importance of this
it
pattern. Like
it
why does it?
wouldn't really make a difference, but just for someone who like works with EEG data, it makes more sense to me to put the first channel first, then the second channel. Because you can look across channels, obviously, and that is exactly what EEG net does. You have a depth-wise convolution as well as a temporal convolution.
Hmm.
So that is essentially for looking across the channels. But I don't know, in my head, it just made sense to do it like that because it makes more sense in an EEG context. But yes, from an implementation perspective, it should not make a difference because attention would still work.
Right. And also, like, do they employ the same positional embeddings to these? Basically, if I have two set of patches, basically the ordering is different. One, I'm passing it channel by channel, and one, I'm passing it patch by patch. So if I'm applying a positional encoding on them, so do they employ the same positional encoding in both of these types of inputs, or is the
So we
positional encoding
we
different?
we don't really, they haven't really talked about this ordering at all.
Acha.
So, irrespective of however they do it, it's just like one set of positional encodings.
Mm.
So, yeah,
So I
they
think they
they
won't be using any techniques like rope embeddings, right? And
no,
they are learning the embeddings
yes,
because of
exactly,
the channel because channels are
exactly.
also related and stuff. So they are actually
Yeah,
learning.
yeah. So I will come to that in the next slide. But the position embeddings are essentially learned, and they also want to keep track of the index. So they want the positional embeddings to capture both the index as well as the channel placement. So it's
Mhm.
just a learnable weight matrix, but we'll just come to that in the next slide.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah. Also, just one question, like
yeah.
why CNN tokenizer does not help and the simple tokenizer they have used, like any
So
major.
CNN tokenizer definitely works,
Mm-hmm.
and there are papers that have shown CNN tokenizers to be very effective. The
Okay.
argument that they are making over here is
Mm-hmm.
that it can often get very computationally expensive, or
Okay.
so they claim. But what they are trying to demonstrate, I think, is that you can do a decent enough job without
Mm-hmm.
the CNN tokenizer as well. So for
Mm-hmm.
EEG data, what the claim that they're trying to make is that you can get away with a simple linear projection.
Okay, the simpler
Yeah,
approach, less
yeah,
latency and stuff.
yeah.
Okay.
There's like nothing wrong with the CNN tokenizer.
Okay, okay.
It works
Thank you.
well. Yeah,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank
yeah, no problem. So then we have our patches, and obviously it's just a simple linear layer. And yeah, so in the end, our XC will have a dimension of n cross d model, where essentially for each token, you get a vector of size d mod. Yes.
Daya, sorry for interrupting.
Yeah.
So, so this XP is a token. It's a patch, and it is like each patch will be a token, right?
Yes.
Or even XP will be broken into different tokens, or is XP just a token?
XP is n cross d. So n is your number of tokens, and each token or patch is of length d.
Can you go to the previous slide, please? The definition of N
N
is
is basically T by D multiplied by C. So T is your time, how long
mm,
your trial is essentially, and you are dividing that into D length patches. So you get T by D number of patches for one channel. But since
yeah.
you have C number of channels, you just multiply by C. So N is essentially the total number of tokens or patches that you get for one trial. And a trial has a certain number of channels and is of a certain length.
Okay. So each token will have like 64 like numbers or data points, right? That's
Time
what it is.
samples. Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay.
Yes, but each
Okay.
token is one channel. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Because they patch
Okay.
it channel wise. Okay.
Okay.
So XP is just N cross D. So all of your patches and each patch is 64 time samples. Okay. Awesome. So we've already, I feel, gone over why they have picked a linear layer. And then these are certain default hyperparameters that they have used for their model. They have done no aberration that I could see regarding these parameters. So I feel it's a fairly reasonable default choice, and it seems to work. Okay, so next we can come to our positional embeddings. Really simple, they add a classification token. That is what they'll use at the end. Fairly simple. So just to go over the shapes ones, XC was N cross D model. Once you add a class token, it'll become N plus 1 cross D model. And that's the same as the dimensionality of your positional embeddings, which is N plus 1 cross D model. So basically, they just they prepend this class token, and then they add the positional embeddings, which is nothing but a weight matrix of size N plus 1 cross D mod. Okay. So the key point over here that I want to emphasize is that these positional embeddings are learned, and they have later looked at these positional embeddings to see whether they make sense. So we'll come to that as well. But the main reasoning why they've given behind using a learned positional embeddings is that like I mentioned, the tokens are per channel cross time patches. So there isn't an obvious 1D ordering that can essentially capture the entire scalp geometry, right? So they want the model to essentially be able to discover these relationships between these sensors rather than having to impose that beforehand. And what this does is that it will eventually allow their model to be able to handle various montages. So in an EEG, how and where you place your EEG sensors is basically dictated by a montage. Now, there are different montages that essentially tell us where particular sensors should be positioned. And when that montage changes, it can make it difficult for certain models to be able to handle the input. So what they are claiming is that our model can essentially do that.
Just one
Yeah.
question. So here, like, sorry if this is very basic, but so you said in this paper they are learning positional embeddings, right? So
Yes.
I agree with the argument for learning positional embeddings for the different channels because they are located on different parts of the head and like there's no natural ordering or something like so they are learning. But if it was, but these tokens they are temporally sliced as well, right? So when in the temporal dimension, there's a natural ordering, right? Like whatever you
Yeah.
got in the first second, third second, it has a natural order, right? So is there any constraint that they impose on this embedding to like show the transformer that this token came on the first second, this token came on the second or something like that? Like because temporally
Yeah.
there's a natural order, right?
Yeah. So not explicitly, But because they are patching in a temporal order, and I assume it is channel major, so that temporal ordering is essentially sort of maintained at least per channel. So it's not explicit, but for each n plus one token, you have a D model, right? Vector.
Mhm.
So this n ordering would essentially be in line, but they haven't
Yeah. So
explicitly mentioned or tried to enforce that
yeah,
explicitly.
within the slice, you are taking a
Yeah,
D length slice. I agree that
yeah,
within the length, the temporal ordering is preserved, but across the tokens, like I'm
yeah.
not sure how transformers work. Like if you give one token and then if you give a second token, does the
Mhm.
transformer know that they are coming in an order, or like is like there's no notion of ordering when you're giving tokens into transformers? Because if not, like it can learn to associate like different. I'm not sure if I'm framing the question correctly. Maybe. Uh, uh,
Yeah, no, it makes sense what you're asking, and there is a notion like that is why for transformers we add the position embedding, right, to inform the model of where the token is essentially coming from.
Yeah,
Yeah,
from what
so
I
that
learned in the
yeah,
last presentation, like if there is a sentence, then we give a positional embedding to tell the transformer that this is the first word, this is the last word, this is the word in the middle. So
yeah,
in that sense, like that the order of words in the sentence, we are kind of giving the information to transformer. But if we are letting the transformer learn that ordering, the positional encoding, then how would it like how can we make sure that it actually learn this sentence here, not just a jumble of words that has that from this sentence?
yeah. So essentially, for this, they have basically later on looked at the positional embeddings that the model learned and
Okay.
computed like the cosine similarity between the embeddings and seen whether it makes sense from a neurophysiological perspective. And
Hmm.
we will get to that in one of the later slides, but it does seem to add up. Like
Okay, but
what
I'm
you would
yeah.
expect, it's more from the point of view of like channels that are close by to each other should
Hmm.
have similar embeddings, right?
Hmm.
So that is something that they can see.
Hmm.
So it
Okay.
it seems that this approach of letting the model learn the positional embeddings on its own seems to work. Like it is able to um, gather together and figure out that these channels are positionally close to each other. And a reason for that can be that in EEG, generally sensors are close to each other, right?
Hmm.
So a
Hmm.
sensor that is here versus a sensor that is here, the
Hmm.
activity on those signals will be very correlated.
Yeah.
And that is something that we see. Like if you plot a correlation matrix of EEG signals, you will find that electrodes that are near each other are highly correlated. So it is
Hmm.
possible that based on the patterns of activity that it is seeing, it is able to infer that maybe
Hmm.
these two electrodes are positioned close to each other.
Okay.
That
Okay.
would
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
my guess.
Yeah. So, just off the top of my head, let rather than learning the entire personal embedding, like for the temporal
Yeah.
aspect of the data, we can impose some embedding and then learn the embedding for channel, uh, like uh, um, just
Yeah. Yeah.
thinking out loud.
Absolutely.
So,
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
so what they have done is just classification tasks, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my understanding would be that why they have chosen it this way instead of imposing positional embeddings on the temporal axis. So because it's a classification task, then it doesn't matter where the temporal patches are and how it's what's there and not. You're just going to classify at the end. So wherever these patches are and whatever it's learning through the positional embeddings, it won't matter because you're not actually generating something. In a language model, you have an autoregressive behavior, so you are actually generating tokens after that. So that's why you need some form of temporal embeddings that give you specific information about, okay, this is the first token, this is second, this is third, this is fourth. But when you are learning embeddings, for a classification task, I don't think it will matter if the temporal patches are aligned with the position embedding of the temporal side.
Yeah, you
Mm.
don't really need the causality to be maintained over here.
Yeah, because
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
your final task is classification. But
Yeah,
if
yeah.
it was something related to maybe autoregressive decoding or something, then it would make sense to have something like that. And in LabRAM, they actually did this. They added tokens according to the positional embeddings were according to temporal side and channel side separately, so that it
Mm.
makes sense in that way.
Yeah. I understand the argument. Like, it's just a classification task. So if it does that reasonably, then why would we need it? But my thinking is that, like this, we are just destroying this temporal information that we actually have, right? Why not make use of it? That's my thought process. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry for taking
Yeah,
too much time.
no, that would definitely be something interesting to look at. Okay, so I think we can go ahead. So the next is fairly simple. It's just our transformer encoder. And I think in the previous session, Mehar went over this in a lot of detail. So it's nothing complicated. You basically get your X pause from here. And this is essentially your embeddings that you got from the linear projection with the class token embedded and the positional embeddings added. And basically you pass that through a layer norm, and then it goes through multi-head self-attention, and then you add it back to the residual. Then what you get from the multi-head self-attention block again gets passed through the layer norm. You pass it through an FFN, add it back to the residual. So this is fairly simple. And essentially here they have said that the layer norm is applied before these two blocks of multi-head self-attention and feed-forward, because they have said that it typically improves optimization stability for deeper transformers. But they have done no ablation to further support that.
So for this, there are papers already out there
Yeah,
which have
exactly.
shown the pre-norm and post-norm. So,
Yeah.
so just to mention that, that's because of you have a residual stream that is uninterrupted by any layer norms. So the
Mhm.
gradients can flow directly till the end without any modification to that. So vanishing gradient problem comes when you have a layer norm in the residual stream.
Yeah, and this is
So
like the
that's why it's
standard
like that.
process, right? Layer norm apply first and then do the multi-head attention.
So in the original
So,
transformer paper, the layer norm is post. That it's
okay.
not pre, it's post. That's
Mm,
why there was
okay.
a problem there.
But in time series data, we do this, like we apply layer norm and then MHSA. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So it makes more sense in the context
Yeah.
of EEG.
Mm.
Yeah, and the final prediction is again by linear layer. Just take a softmax over it, so you get class probabilities over in case of motor imagery, there are 5 classes, so you just get the class probabilities over that. And again, attention over here makes sense because every token can attend to every other token. Patches stay local while attention can essentially look for global task relevant patterns. And compared to CNNs, this is essentially not constrained to local receptive fields. So the premise is that attention should do a good job with EEG as well. And we know that it does do that. So these are the data sets that they have used. Again, they have simply stuck to the motor imagery task. They have not explored any other task. So for pre-training, they use these 5 data sets. These are fairly well published data sets. And for fine tuning, they've used two other data sets, again, motor imagery based. And they have essentially evaluated three different training objectives. So the first is no pre-training. So they directly train PBT on the downstream tasks and just swap out the classification head based on the number of classes in the downstream tasks. That's the first one. The second one is supervised pre-training. So basically, they pool all of these 5 pre-training datasets together, and they combine the label space to make it consistent for these datasets. And what they found was after combining these 5, the class distribution is fairly even. So this seemed to be a good approach. So they have pre-trained on these 5 datasets and then fine-tuned further on the downstream datasets. And the third one that they have looked at is self-supervised pre-training. So for this approach, this is essentially what BERT also followed. So they use randomly masking tokens and reconstructing them. But in the context of EEG, you need to ensure that the reconstruction task is not trivial. So EEG signals are recorded as voltage differences between a sensor and a reference electrode. So as a result, the signal from a sensor positioned spatially between two other signals can be approximated as the mean of the two adjacent sensors. So due to this technical property of EEG signals, what they have done is that they randomly manipulate patches along the time dimension and they mask with a probability of 30%. For the patch that is chosen to be masked, they use an 80-10-10 scheme, which is similar to what was used in BERT. And most of essentially what they do in this is that of the 30% of the tokens that are basically selected to be masked, 80% of them are masked, 10% are basically replaced with a random patch, and 10% of them are left unchanged. They also attach a reconstruction head that basically maps the transformer outputs back to the patch space, and then they train using a cosine reconstruction loss, as you can see, between the original patch and what was reconstructed. So these were the 3 different training objectives that they've looked at.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay. So, can you explain again how they are masking? Because this just seems a bit weird to me.
Yeah. So what they've said is that you have your patches, right?
Mhm.
So basically, with a 30% probability, you're going to pick a patch to mask. Okay. Once you have picked a patch to mask, you can either choose to mask it, or that is with a probability of 80%, or you can replace it with another random patch from the batch with the probability of 10%, or you can leave it unchanged.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, like I said, they have mentioned that it's fairly easy to be able to reconstruct an EEG signal that sits between two sensors, right? You just take the
Mhm.
mean of that. So I think what they are trying to do is simply masking may not like can be trivial for the model, or so they say. Obviously, this is very different from what Lebram and all have done, where they've simply masked.
Yeah.
But what they are saying is that sometimes if you replace it with a random patch, or just simply leave it unchanged, it seems to work.
Yeah, I would still say that I don't agree with this patching
Is,
scheme that
is it
the
not
masking scheme.
distortion? Yeah, is it not distortion like kind of like 80% they mask and then added?
No,
Yeah,
so
random
the
patch would be some form of that you
Hmm.
have
Yeah,
corrupted the signal in some sense.
like random is
um
something, and yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, so it's like 80% of the time you would basically fully mask it out, and
Mm-hmm.
10% of the time you'd essentially replace it with a random patch,
Mm-hmm.
and 10% you'd just leave the patch as it is. So
Okay.
yeah, this is I
Hmm.
think what Bert also followed. So this is what they've done.
Okay, there.
Okay.
What do you think? So what I think in the for patching in this sense would should be for EG would be
Yeah.
to patch out the whole temporal dimension. Uh, so for one time point, you mask out every channel. That should be the patching scheme in EEG, because then you
Yeah.
don't have then you are actually filling in the time dimension in between and actually learning the signal. So if you just pick out some tokens to mask out, you can always infer them from different channels, right? Because every channel is doing
Yeah.
somewhat the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be that would be the better way to do it for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So going ahead, this is again fairly straightforward. Like the models they've compared with are EEGNet. This is a graph-based model, DGCNN. This is again a CNN-based model, ATCNet. And then you have BIOT and LibRAM. And basically how they split. So these are our two fine-tuning data sets, BCI 2A and 2B. For 2A, you have two sessions, so they train on one session, evaluate on a different day. And for 2B, you have already pre-specified train eval splits, so they just use that. And the metric that they report is just the accuracy, which is essentially averaged over 3 random seeds. Okay. So these are their main results. And over here, you see their three models with the three different training paradigms. So no pre-training, supervised pre-training, and self-supervised pre-training. Then you have EGNet, the graph-based model, and ATCNet. Then you have BIOT, no pre-training, self-supervised pre-training, and LibRAM, no pre-training, self-supervised pre-training. So what they find is that on their fine-tuning data sets, the supervised pre-training model seems to achieve the best accuracy, which is interesting. So their main result is that it is small compared to LibRAM and BIOT, um, and it still seems to be more competitive on these downstream tasks. Again, all of this is with a very big caveat because they've only tested on data sets of one particular task. And often it is the data set that can cause the model to not work so well. So like, for example, LabRAM may do a much better job on a slightly different data set. So it's hard to generalize these results to general EEG data. This seems to be more specifically applicable only to motor imagery and for motor imagery data sets. Now, what I found really interesting was that EEGNet was fairly close by to PBT. And I think that's really interesting because it's just 2.5K parameters. It's a simple CNN model for EEG that does a temporal filter and a depth-wise convolution, and you get your output. And it's really, really cool to see that it does a good job. Yeah. And self-supervised pre-training is not as effective as they had expected it to be, but it's fairly close by. Now, the other thing that they've done is data augmentation. So like in any vision or VIT model, or even in transformers, you tend to apply augmentations to the data set to add in variance, right? So the same thing they've tried to do with EEG data as well. So they have no augmentation, they've Gaussian noise, DC shifts, amplitude scaling, and time shifts. And the training data fraction is essentially the fraction of the training data that they randomly selected and applied these augmentations on, and then added back to the original training data set. So as you can see, the time shift with just 10% of augmentation does a really good job. This is for the fine-tuning data 2A. So it does a fairly good job. And essentially, why that might be. So in time shift, basically what you do is that if you have your signal, you essentially crop a little bit out. So you get a smaller signal, and then you shift that. Okay, so that's basically what you're doing. So for motor imagery tasks in your EEG data, you generally have events, like when the participant moved their left hand or their right hand. So you'll have an event marker for that. So when you patch EEG data for these tasks, you tend to basically patch before or after that event marker. So it's very often the case that the model essentially learns to memorize the event onset. So what they are saying is that with time shift, since you're randomly cropping the signal and shifting it around, it forces invariance to event onset timings. And basically this can reduce memorization. So it basically helps the model actually learn the pattern of activity rather than simply memorizing the event onset. And also it increases the effective data set size without changing any labels. And the other thing that they've said is that the DC shift and the amplitude scaling can basically be partly washed out by the layer norm. So what they are saying is that due to this, time shift appears to be the most effective of these augmentations. And what they also found was that without time shift, the model tended to overfit very quickly. So this is in fact the case that it does force invariance and actually force the model to learn those patterns of activity. Okay, then this is just basically what you see over here is for the BCI4 2A dataset. You see 3 different training and testing plots. One in green is what you see is when the this fine-tuning dataset is trained from scratch with no pre-training. The red is self-supervised pre-training, and the blue is supervised training. So what they find essentially is that the self-supervised pre-training, if you look at the test accuracy, it reaches a similar accuracy in fewer fine-tuning steps as compared to training from scratch, which is in green. And the supervised pre-training learns the fastest and attains the best accuracy for their results. So I think in the context of EEG and in the context of motor imagery datasets, simply doing supervised learning can do a good job. Now, they've also tried to do some sort of interpretability analysis. So basically, first, they have looked at the weights of the linear embeddings in the first layer of their model. So the weight matrix of the linear embedding, if you recall from the earlier slides, was D model times D. So in this figure, they have shown a total of D model number of plots. So basically, D model was selected to be 2 times of D, which was 64. So these are 128 plots. And each plot goes from 0 to 63. So it's 64 samples. So these are essentially the weights, and they are treated as filters because if the frequency range of the input is the same as the frequency range that you see over here, then the magnitude of the dot product will either increase if it's the same or vice versa. Simple. That's why they are essentially calling it a filter. And what they observe is these periodic structures that they are interpreting as frequency filters. So based on the time windows with, as I said, a size of 64 samples per patch and a sampling frequency of 250 hertz, each patch essentially corresponds to about 0.25 seconds, okay? Now, each patch is, like I said, 0.256. So that is approximately 1/4 of a second, right? So consequently, what they anticipate is that the frequencies are 4 times the numbers of cycles per patch that you see over here. Because the frequency is the number of cycles you see in 1 second, this is approximately 0.5. So what you're seeing over here, 4 times of that, okay? So what they essentially found here was that the learned filters are in the high frequency range. So from 20 to 40 hertz, which corresponds to beta and gamma waves. And these beta and gamma waves are known to be significant for motor imagery related tasks. So it's interesting, and essentially they say that due to this, the choice of a linear layer further makes sense in this context. Again, this is only for motor imagery that this makes sense. If you have something like sleep staging, we'll have to do a completely separate analysis, because in that case, you want lower frequencies like 0.5 hertz to 12 hertz, right? So that becomes a whole different context. So again, they haven't experimented with that, so it's hard to make a claim about that. But for motor imagery, it seems to make some sort of sense. Now, what they've also done.
Question. Can you go back?
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't get like how did they make these plots? Like how do you interpret a linear layer as a as a filter?
Yeah, that's the thing. It's not actually a filter, but they're calling it a filter because if your input signal or input patch is basically going to have a similar pattern to this one, then if you take the dot product of that, like we did in the linear layer, then what you'd see is that the amplitude would increase, right? But if it was an opposite pattern, the amplitude would decrease. So in that sense, maybe you can interpret it as a filter. But yeah, it's not very clear why, but that's what they are calling it. They are calling it a frequency filter.
Yeah, linear layer is not a dot product, right? Is it? It's a matrix multiple. It's a linear transformation. So
Right here.
yeah, it's a transformation from one space to another space. So I'm thinking in terms of that. If you're
I think what's happening
transforming,
is that your XP is n cross D. So you have n patches of length D. WE is D model cross D. So if you take the transpose of WE, it becomes D cross D model. So you're basically the two D dimensions will get multiplied, and that multiplication is basically a dot product, right? So for every patch, you have D model number of uh, vectors of size D, and you take a dot product of every patch with all of these vectors,
okay.
right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because our patch is one dimensional.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Makes sense. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's what they have done. The other thing they have looked at, like I mentioned, was the positional encoding. Can I zoom in to the figure? Okay, because it's hard to see like this, but basically what they've done is that they have tried to look at the cosine similarity between the positional embeddings of an electrode at a particular location versus all the other positional embeddings. Yeah, maybe just, oh, okay, I don't think that'll work either. Are you guys able to see the figure?
Yeah, I think so. It is
Okay,
visible.
Maybe you can
okay.
stop presenting and zoom in, then
Yeah.
I think we'd see your screen. Like
No,
in the presentation mode, can you go out of the presentation mode? And then,
yeah. Okay, let's see. Does that make it better? Okay,
yep.
awesome. So basically over here, the bright yellow spot is the self cosine similarity. So that's one. And what you see is, for example, if you look at FC3 and FC1, the positional embeddings are like really similar to each other. So this is the first thing that they highlight, that essentially the model is able to, for similar positions, it learns similar positional embeddings. The second really interesting thing that they saw was with this central chain. So if you focus on from CZ, C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, there's basically a symmetric pattern happening here. So if you look at C1 and C2, you will look, if you look at the positional embeddings, they're really symmetric to one another. Same for C3 and C4. It's really symmetric. And finally, for C5 and C6, ignoring the yellow dot, the rest of the embeddings appear to be really symmetric to one another. And what is further very interesting is that this entire central chain is essentially correlated to the motor cortex. And these electrodes like C3 and C4 have consistently been reported in the literature to be extremely relevant for motor imagery tasks. So that was really interesting. Another thing they have done is that they have looked at essentially attention maps in a sense. But what was really interesting to me was they've only done this for one subject. So what you see over here, these 4 plots are just for the first subject. They've basically taken all the patches and they've colored it based on their attention score. So just looking at what was the most important. So if you look at the left hand and the right hand ones, and these are based on the category of classification. So if you look at the left hand and the right hand one, it is really interesting to see that C3 is highlighted for the right hand. So if you look here, C3, maybe second. If you look over here, C3 is highlighted for your left hand. And for, sorry, I think I got the wrong plot. No, I did. C3 is for right hand, and C4, if you look over here, although it's only in this one, but it does seem to be highlighted. And for motor imagery tasks, C3 and C4 are like really key channels. So again, it is very hard to generalize. It is very hard to make a claim over here since they've only done this for one subject. It's hard to basically generalize, but it does seem to be the case that the attention mechanism is highlighting the central motor regions, which are relevant for our motor imagery classes. So that was another interesting thing. Okay, so coming to some of the limitations of this work. As I mentioned, the experiments are focused entirely on motor imagery decoding, so it's very unclear how well the same design will transfer to other EEG paradigms. The second thing they have done is that for the supervised pre-training, which did the best job for their case, they combined 5 different pre-training data sets, right? And they basically merge the labels across those 5 data sets. But that is not always such an easy thing to do in EEG data sets. You run into a lot of issues. You will run into different labels. It may be possible after merging that the classes become really imbalanced. For example, in sleep staging, the class N1 is very, very, very hard to classify. It is often confused with N2 or wake. So in sleep staging data sets, you will find that the proportion of N1 classes is very, very less. So this can be another issue that will not be so easy when you try to transfer this to other tasks. The other thing is montage variability. They have claimed that their model can handle different montages, but they have done absolutely no experimentation to support this. The other is the metric. They've just reported accuracy, but it would be nice to see other metrics as well to see how we are doing at a subject level as well. Okay. So the key takeaway over here would be that a simple patch and a linear embedding transformer can be strong for EEG. The second is that supervised pre-training does a great job. The third is time shift augmentation seems to be very important for motor imagery data sets, especially to avoid overfitting. And the learned positional embeddings and attention does seem to make some sense. So future ideas, there can be quite a few things. Maybe we can tailor the self-supervised objective to be more aligned to EEG. We can do cross-paradigm pre-training, not just motor imagery. We can look at the montage transfer in more detail. It would be also nice to look at the idea that Niruhan suggested, like what was done in LabRAM, like if you can have a separate temporal embedding, separate channel embedding, that would be nice. And yeah, essentially stress test this for different hardware recording sites sessions, because that is always a problem with EEG. Okay, I think that was everything from my end.
Thank you, Daya. Great
It was
presentation.
a fairly short presentation with
Thank
a
No,
you.
नहीं बढ़िया था.
Insightful
it was
presentation.
awesome.
Yeah.
the paper was fairly simple. Like they've not done too much. They've basically just swapped out the CNN. Not even swapped out essentially, because in a VIT also you use a linear projection. So I don't know what they were trying to do. But in the context of EEG, what they tried, especially for motor imagery, it's very insightful. Like people who work with motor imagery data, there's a lot that you can pick up from this paper. But yeah, I don't know how much it generalizes to other domains. Like, I don't think I can pick up these insights and directly apply them to, say, sleep.
Oh, but it was very insightful. It's good to see that the learned positional embedding is
Yeah.
learning the spatial structure.
Yeah, that was
So,
it. That
Yeah.
was interesting. Although this was only for 22 electrodes. So
mhm,
I don't know what will happen when you change the
yeah,
montage essentially. If you go to
if you go to
64 or less,
128 to
128,
56.
or if you just go to like 8 electrodes where you are more spaced out.
Mhm.
I don't know how
Yeah.
it's going to learn those.
Yeah. To me, it seems that there is an underlying structure which the model discovered it, but there is an
Mm,
underlying structure. So maybe we should come up with something that is it's
yeah,
there, right?
yeah.
So just like rope embeddings, so we
Hmm.
should come up with something like that.
Yeah, I mean, they got away with a simple linear projection, simple learned embeddings with no complications, no fancy encoders used anywhere,
Mm-hmm.
and it seems to do a decent job. But again, it's very hard to generalize
Yeah.
because it's only tested for motor imagery. So
Yeah.
it's very
And
hard to
like
make a
how
claim.
simply their architecture is and working well, and then the complex model,
Yeah.
and yeah, that makes it
I think
really
for me,
insightful.
I think the best
Thank
result
you.
for me was EEG net.
Easy
I was
net,
so
Yeah.
yeah.
happy.
Less parameters and like it's working really well. Yeah.
Yeah, that was good to
Mm.
see.
Yeah.
That a model that came out in 2016, improved in
Mm.
2018, still does a good
Yeah.
job today.
Yeah, really good presentation. Like learned a lot of new concepts and
I'm
like yeah,
glad.
how the CET thinks. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thanks there. Thanks. I learned about the EEG processing. I had no background in it. Thanks for introducing me to it.
I'm
I hope
glad.
to have more chats about this in the lab. Thank you for the
Absolutely.
present.
We have a lot of people who are working on EEG in the lab, so EEG
Yeah.
discussions are always welcome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.